Archaeologists in Britain say they've made an astonishing find. They believe they've uncovered the remains of long-lost royalty. He happens to be King Richard III.
The DNA extracted from King Richard III's remains is revealing a story that history has kept buried for centuries. A story of betrayal, secrecy, and deception hidden deep within the royal bloodline. This isn't just about the age-old mystery of the princes in the tower. What scientists uncovered goes much deeper. The genetic evidence points to a break, a hidden fracture, in the very lineage that defined who had the right to rule England. It means that somewhere along the royal line, someone wasn't who the history books claimed they were. And that changes everything we thought we knew about the English crown. Richard's blood tells a story of lost legitimacy, of a kingdom built on a lie. And in the process, a royal grave was disturbed to reveal the truth the monarchy never meant to surface. For more than 5 centuries, the final resting place of King Richard III was shrouded in mystery. History recorded that he fell in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth, the last great clash of the brutal Wars of the Roses. According to old accounts, his body was taken to Leicester and buried without ceremony at the Grey Friars Monastery. But over time, the friary was torn down, its exact location forgotten, and the story of Richard's grave slipped into legend. Many believed the king's remains were lost forever. Some even claimed his bones had been dug up and thrown into a river, a final insult to a defeated monarch. Then, in 2012, everything changed. A team of archaeologists began an excavation in the most unexpected place imaginable, a city council car park in Leicester. Historical maps suggested that the old Grey Friars once stood right beneath that very spot, its foundations hidden under layers of modern pavement. Few thought they'd find anything significant, let alone the remains of a lost English king. But then, the unthinkable happened. Just days into the dig, the team uncovered a human skeleton. What caught everyone off guard was its location, right where records indicated Richard III had been buried, in the choir of the old friary church. Labeled simply as Skeleton 1, the remains were that of a man in his early 30s. And as it turned out, Richard III was 32 when he fell in battle. The bones told a story of brutal combat. There were at least 10 distinct injuries, 8 of them to the skull, showing signs of savage strikes from swords or halberds. The most chilling detail? Some of the cuts suggested his helmet had been torn away in his final moments, leaving him exposed to fatal blows. It all matched the grisly historical accounts of Richard III's death on the battlefield. But the most revealing clue wasn't in the wounds, it was in the spine. The skeleton showed severe scoliosis, a pronounced S-shaped curve that would have caused one shoulder to sit noticeably higher than the other. Chroniclers from Richard's own time had written about his uneven shoulders, a feature that Shakespeare would later twist into the image of a deformed, villainous hunchback. The truth, however, was far more human. Richard wasn't the monster from the plays, but he did live with a serious physical condition, one that he could never have concealed. For centuries, history painted him through propaganda. Now, the bones offered physical proof. Radiocarbon dating placed the remains firmly in the late 15th century, exactly when Richard died. Even more telling, chemical analysis of the teeth revealed a diet rich in luxury, fine meats and seafood, the unmistakable markers of royal privilege. Everything lined up, the age, the wounds, the spinal curvature, even the diet. But for the world to accept that this truly was Richard III, one thing was still missing: undeniable proof. They needed DNA, the kind of evidence that doesn't lie. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Finding a genetic match after more than 500 years is almost impossible. The challenge was clear. Connect this ancient skeleton to living relatives and solve one of the greatest missing person mysteries in history. The bones had already told a remarkable story, but only DNA could uncover the truth, a truth that could expose a royal secret buried for centuries. With what might be the remains of a king lying before them, all eyes turned to the scientists in the lab. The archaeological evidence was strong, but the world wanted absolute proof. The question was, could DNA, drawn from bones that had been buried for over 500 years, truly confirm the identity of Richard III? It was an enormous task. Ancient DNA is fragile, easily destroyed by time or contaminated by modern handling. But if it worked, the results would rewrite history. The scientists focused on two special types of genetic markers that remain almost unchanged as they pass down through generations: mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, and the Y chromosome. They began with mitochondrial DNA. Unlike most genetic material, this type is inherited only through the maternal line, from mother to child. That means you, your siblings, and your mother all share the same mitochondrial DNA. Genealogists then embarked on an extraordinary feat of historical detective work. They painstakingly traced Richard III's family tree through his sister, Anne of York, following an unbroken maternal line across 19 generations and more than 5 centuries. Their search led to 2 living descendants: Michael Ibsen, a furniture maker from London, and Wendy Duldig, a Canadian-born researcher. Both were Richard III's great-nieces, 16 times removed. When the lab results came in, the verdict was astonishing. The mitochondrial DNA from the skeleton was an exact match with both Michael and Wendy. The chances of that happening by coincidence were virtually zero. This was the moment the world had been waiting for. In February 2013, researchers at the University of Leicester made it official. The remains discovered beneath the car park were beyond any reasonable doubt those of King Richard III. Case closed, or so everyone thought. Because while the mitochondrial DNA had confirmed his identity through his mother's line, it was only half the story. The other half would uncover a royal secret no one was prepared for. Next, scientists turned their attention to the Y chromosome, the genetic code passed directly from father to son, generation after generation. In theory, Richard III's Y chromosome should have matched that of other living men descended from the same male royal line, the Plantagenets. Researchers traced that lineage back to King Edward III and found several living male line descendants, mostly from the Somerset family. They collected DNA samples, ran the comparisons, and prepared to seal the case with final confirmation. But what came next stunned everyone. The results didn't match. The Y chromosome from Richard III's remains was completely different from that of his supposed male descendants. Instead of confirming his royal bloodline, the test exposed a long-buried secret, a break in the chain of succession itself. Somewhere in the 19 generations separating Richard III from his modern relatives, there had been what scientists politely call a false paternity event. In simpler terms, someone's recorded father wasn't their biological father. A royal affair, a hidden child, a broken bloodline. The implications were explosive. This wasn't just a family scandal from centuries ago. It raised serious questions about the legitimacy of the English crown itself. A single hidden indiscretion could have altered the course of royal succession. The discovery sent shockwaves through the historical community. While Richard's identity was confirmed through his mother's side, his paternal DNA revealed a fracture running deep through the royal family tree. The question was no longer if a scandal had occurred, but when and where. Because the Y chromosome study had involved descendants of Edward III, a king who ruled more than a century before Richard. That meant The break in the bloodline could have happened at any point in those generations between them. There were countless possibilities, and each carried dramatically different consequences for history. If the false paternity event had occurred early on, perhaps even with one of Edward III's own sons, it would mean that the royal line of the later Plantagenet kings, including Richard III himself, was built on a lie. They might never have been the true biological heirs they claimed to be. But if the break happened much later, in the lineage of the modern relatives tested, then Richard's bloodline might actually be legitimate, and theirs the one in question. Here's what most people don't realize. For monarchs, bloodline wasn't just important, it was everything. Their divine right to rule, their claim to the throne, and their very identity as kings and queens rested on an unbroken chain from father to son. The most startling truth is that just one act of infidelity could, in theory, invalidate an entire dynasty. That makes this discovery especially ironic. The Wars of the Roses, that brutal 30-year civil conflict that split England apart, was fought over who had the most legitimate claim to the throne. The House of York, Richard's family, and the House of Lancaster both traced their ancestry back to Edward III. They shed rivers of blood over the question of who was the rightful heir. And now, 5 centuries later, modern science suggests that the very idea of a pure, unbroken Plantagenet bloodline might have been a myth all along. It's possible that both sides were fighting for a crown that, genetically speaking, neither of them had a perfect claim to. In the aftermath of the discovery, historians began re-examining old records, family trees, and even forgotten rumors, desperate to pinpoint where the break might have occurred. Suspicions soon fell on key figures like John of Gaunt, one of Edward III's most powerful sons, whose descendants founded the House of Lancaster. Could the scandal have begun with him? Or perhaps the truth lay even closer to Richard, with his own father, Richard, Duke of York. Even in the 15th century, whispers had spread that Richard's mother, Cecily Neville, might have had an affair while her husband was away at war. If that rumor held any truth, it would mean that Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, never had a legitimate claim to the throne at all. The DNA hinted at a secret, but the details, the who, when, and where, remain just beyond reach, a ghost of a scandal still haunting the pages of English history. But the story didn't end there, because while the DNA had sparked headlines and controversy, the bones themselves held even more profound revelations about the man behind the myth. As the world obsessed over the royal scandal written in his genes, the skeleton quietly told its own story. The genetic findings were shocking, yes, but they were only one piece of a much larger puzzle, one that forced historians to confront just how wrong centuries of legend had been. For those who doubted the discovery, thinking it might be some elaborate hoax or media sensation, the truth lay right there in the remains. The bones didn't just confirm the king's identity, they completely rewrote the story of who Richard III truly was. Let's begin with that infamous hunchback. Thanks to Shakespeare, the world has long pictured Richard III as a twisted, malevolent figure, his physical deformity supposedly reflecting his inner corruption. But when scientists examined his spine, what they discovered was both fascinating and deeply human. Yes, Richard did suffer from severe adolescent-onset scoliosis. His spine curved sharply to the right, which would have made one shoulder sit higher than the other and shortened his height by a few inches. But he wasn't the grotesque cripple history made him out to be. His condition would have caused some discomfort, certainly, but it wouldn't have stopped him from riding, fighting, or leading men into battle. In fact, the bones showed strong muscle attachments, clear signs of a man who was active, powerful, and physically capable. What had once been used as proof of evil turned out to be nothing more than a medical condition. His enemies didn't just defeat him, they twisted his body into a symbol of moral corruption. Then came the revelations hidden in the chemistry of his bones and teeth, a kind of diary written in isotopes. From these, scientists could trace where Richard had lived, what he ate, and even what he drank. The findings were remarkable. As a child, he moved around England, mirroring his family's changing fortunes during the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. But after ascending to the throne, everything changed. His diet transformed into one of royal indulgence, rich with luxury meats like swan, crane, and venison. And the isotopes revealed something even more surprising. Richard was consuming enormous amounts of alcohol. Based on carbon and nitrogen ratios, scientists estimated that in his final years he was drinking roughly the equivalent of a bottle of wine every day. It wasn't just a glimpse of royal excess, it was proof of his elevated status. These weren't the habits of an outcast or usurper, they were the marks of a man living the life of a true king. But perhaps the most haunting discovery came when scientists reconstructed his face. Using a 3D scan of the skull, forensic artists digitally rebuilt it layer by layer, bone, muscle, skin, until a face slowly emerged from the past. And what appeared wasn't the sneering villain of legend. It was the face of a calm, intelligent man, one marked by quiet authority and the faint weariness of leadership. The resemblance to early portraits of Richard III was uncanny, almost unsettling in its accuracy. When genetic data was added, the picture became even clearer. Richard likely had blue eyes and, as a child, light blonde hair that darkened as he aged. For the first time in half a millennium, people could look into the eyes of the last Plantagenet king, a man long condemned as a murderer, and see not a monster, but a human being. And then came the most brutal revelation of all, how he died. The bones recorded every violent moment of his final battle, Bosworth Field, 1485, where Richard faced the forces of Henry Tudor. His skeleton bore 11 wounds, 9 of them to the head. 2 of the wounds were instantly fatal. One blow had cleaved through the back of his skull, slicing away part of the bone with the sheer force of the strike. Another drove deep into the base of the head, a single devastating thrust that would have ended his life in an instant. Forensic experts believe that, by that moment, Richard's helmet had already been torn from his head, leaving him exposed to the merciless chaos of the battlefield. The remaining injuries, cuts, slashes, and punctures across his body, tell the story of his final desperate stand. He was no longer fighting on horseback, as a king should, but on foot, surrounded by enemies on every side. Each wound is a frozen moment of violence, a testament to a man who refused to surrender even as the world collapsed around him. And then came the final indignity. After death, Richard's body was stripped of his armor, a symbol of both humiliation and triumph for his conquerors. Contemporary accounts suggest his naked corpse may have been slung over the back of a horse and paraded through the streets as a trophy of Tudor victory. Finally, his remains were carried to the nearby friary and buried in haste, without ceremony, without honor, and without a coffin. The grave was shallow, unmarked, and forgotten for centuries. Over time, the friary itself vanished beneath layers of earth, brick, and modern life. The king's bones lay in silence under what would one day become an ordinary parking lot in Leicester. And yet, those bones, torn, broken, and buried in obscurity, spoke louder than any legend. They told the story of a man, not a monster, a king who fought to the bitter end, a commander who led from the front, not a coward hiding behind others. He was no twisted tyrant from a playwright's imagination, but a warrior undone by betrayal, politics, and the cruel hand of fate. For over 500 years, his enemies controlled the narrative, shaping Richard III into the villain history wanted him to be. But the discovery beneath that car park changed everything. The victors may have written the chronicles, but the bones, they wrote the truth. And that truth forces us to confront an unsettling question. If the royal bloodline itself was fractured, if kings and queens rose and fell upon a secret no one dared speak, then what does that say about the very idea of the divine right to rule? Was the English crown built on truth, or on a centuries-old deception buried in the bloodline? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories that rewrite history itself.